听专家解读美国升学方案，看美国学习生活点滴，圆美国名校梦想。本节目由美国文美教育集团冠名播出。
大家好，欢迎收看文美集团美国升学直通车。文美集团美国升学直通车是华人网和文美教育集团联合制作播出的北美首档大型的网络直播教育节目。在我们的节目当中，你将会了解到最新最权威的教育资讯，还有升学的建议。无论你是学生还是家长，有任何的美国升学教育问题，都可以给我们留言。首先来介绍一下文美集团。美国文美集团，美国大学申请规划服务第一品牌，20年经验，万博士领衔常春藤顾问团队，中美双顾问模式服务一个学生，按照大学录取学校排名收费，与孩子形成利益共同体。华人老品牌，值得您的信赖。文美集团隆重推出 ACAP 大学专业及职业测评规划管理系统，华人升学机构首创，完美解决华人学生最大升学痛点。人工智能提前锁定大学专业方向，提前2到5年布局申请。有了专业测评系统，孩子的课程规划更清晰，活动更聚焦，文书更有故事感，大学申请更有竞争力。5到11年级学生都可以报名参加测评。文美集团1对1非营利组织成立运营领导力项目，让孩子从参与者变为领导者，真正成长、成人、成才进名校。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。文美集团社会影响力联合国网络义工课程，节省孩子时间，做名校认可的社会影响力，高大上义工。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。今天我们邀请到前康奈尔大学的面试官，同时也是文美集团的顾问 Mr. Pierre 先生，和我们来深度解析2026年到2027年美国 Top 20大学的录取趋势。有请 Mr. Pierre。
Hi.This is Pierre Rodriguez for WinMei. I'm an admissions counselor as well as an SAT prep tutor. This video presentation will discuss the topic of admissions trends at top 20 universities for the cycle of 2026 to 2027 and on. So I'd like to start out by saying that the latest admissions data show that getting into the most prestigious colleges is harder than ever. So I wanted to start by establishing that sense of urgency. Acceptance rates at Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and other Ivy League peers have plunged to record lows. Even as colleges admit more students from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds, in this presentation, we're going to explore why college admissions have become so competitive, what new patterns are emerging, and even a few insider secrets that are not widely publicized. Our goal is to help you understand how the landscape is shifting from what it was and how students can do different things to adapt and respond better. So the first topic under this section is going to be skyrocketing selectivity. So record low acceptance rates. Top schools are admitting smaller and smaller percentages of applicants. For example, Harvard this year it just admitted 3.19% of its class 2026 applicants, which is officially the lowest in its history. Similarly, Columbia reported a 3.73 admit rate for its class of 2026. Yale's overall rate for the class of 2030 was 4.24%, which is down from 4.75 the previous year. These are dramatic drops from just a few years ago. For instance, Harvard had an admissions rate of 5.2% for the class of 2018. The next topic would be growing applicant pools. So these low rates are driven by record numbers of applications. Harvard saw its application pool reach a new high in 2022, contributing to that 3.19% admit rate. So essentially more and more students are applying. So essentially what you can think about is that it's more competitive. There's more competition, more people that you have to beat out for the same number of seats. Stanford, Yale, MIT, and others also report historically large applicant pools. Easier online applications, for instance, the Common App, more students applying to many schools at once. For instance, I've seen many videos on YouTube where students literally apply and make decision videos for content. Whether they have a realistic chance of applying or not, sometimes is not even important. It's just for the content. And so you'll have students applying to colleges where it's practically a reach school in a high number. So like a high number of reach schools, but simply so that they can make a reaction video. So that's going to be a small percentage that explains everything. But the idea is that students will see these videos and then also imagine that they should also be taking, a bigger shot and apply to a wider number, a range of schools. So, and then the other point to follow up would be that rising interest has also been coming from international and underrepresented students. So that has all increased the demand from them. As for Ivy League and peer schools, every Ivy League school now has an admit rate in the single digits. Stanford's recent common data set showed an overall admit rate around 4%, with approximately an SAT score of 1540 for those submitting. MIT's combined admit rate for the class of 2029 was roughly 4.5%. That is 1,324 admits out of 29,282 applicants. Even traditionally, less selective schools like Cornell have dropped into the 5 to 10% range. In short, among the top 20 universities, acceptance rates is now extremely rare. So now we're going to talk about why competition has grown to understand that better. Several factors explain the rising competition. More applicants per student. It's common now for high-achieving students to apply to 10 to 20 colleges. This is something that I alluded to earlier. Schools report many applicants submitting multiple early/regular applications. Since most applicants are high achievers, rising application counts don't mean weaker applicants. Rather, top schools are selecting from a much larger pool of equally qualified candidates. So in other words, the most competitive students are now realizing that it comes down to just paying for an additional application. So in other words, the difference between applying to 10 colleges versus 15 is simply going to be the additional cost of those 5 applications, as well as possibly a few more essays, which usually is pretty standard for competitive schools. In other words, they have their own essays that you need to respond to. The other interesting factor is the pandemic effects. So beyond being a shock to the world in terms of the healthcare system and overall health, COVID-19 also affected admissions. So during COVID, as you know, many schools went test optional and students applied safely to reach schools, swelling applicant numbers. And the logic there is that because SAT and ACT were now optional, students that maybe had weaker scores in that area could now apply without having to include their scores. So that meant that whereas before they would have to include the score and possibly be at a disadvantage compared to other more competitive students, now they could just do away with that and not include it at all. So what you saw was more and more students applying to schools that they would otherwise not apply to, simply because of the change in testing policy. Now, even as some universities return to requiring tests, as we'll talk about soon, many students still apply widely, keeping volumes high. In other words, we see like a residual effect that has been left over from the pandemic. So in other words, even though schools are requiring SATs now and ACTs, some students are still adopting that mindset of applying as test optional. Granted, the school has that policy. Another factor would be financial aid and diversity initiatives. Generous financial aid and outreach programs at elite universities have attracted more qualified students who might previously have ruled out those schools. For instance, Harvard's new policy covers full costs for families under $75,000. And Princeton and Stanford similarly expanded aid. This has encouraged more low and middle income students, many first generation or Pell eligible, which is the Pell Grant, to apply, broadening the applicant pool. So as financial aid has expanded and become more accommodating, more students that otherwise would not be able to afford going to those prestigious universities because of the cost will now be in a position to apply. And so you see more of them applying. Lastly, we have media exposure. Stories about surging admissions difficulty tend to attract more applicants. Everyone's applying to Ivies now. In other words, FOMO, the fear of being left out, fear of missing out. So in other words, since you hear that students are applying, in larger numbers, you say to yourself, well, I'm also going to take my shot. I might as well. While that pandemic narrative isn't necessarily helpful, it's true that competitive schools have become highly visible targets. So the bottom line here is that applicants face a supply and demand squeeze. Colleges may not be harder academically than before, but there are far more qualified applicants per seat. This means even students with stellar credentials can't count on admit rates as safety metrics. Instead, focus on presenting the strongest possible application, whether that's grades, the rigor of your courses, essay, or character, to stand out in the competitive crowd. So this is something that we'll discuss in the following videos. The next big topic is going to be standardized testing, a major trend shift. One of the most notable recent trends is the reversal of test optional policies at elite schools. So for instance, Harvard. After 4 years of test optional admissions, Harvard announced in April of 2024 that it will require ACT and SAT scores for applicants to the class of 2029 and beyond. The Faculty of Arts and Sciences cited new research showing that test scores help identify high achievers from under-resourced schools. In other words, students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds now can show their academic merit through something like the SAT. So therefore, it is useful in identifying those students. In other words, students that have the talent but otherwise would not be able to afford or at least demonstrate their academic merit so readily. For Stanford, for fall of 2026 admissions, Stanford reinstituted a testing requirement after a faculty recommendation and governance vote. The decision came as Stanford noticed its entering class had an average of 3.94 GPA and a 1540 SAT for students that submitted their scores, and sought more data for evaluating applicants. For Princeton, starting with the 2027-2028 cycle, the class of 2032, Princeton will once again require SAT and ACT scores. Inside Higher Education reported that this is what makes Princeton the 7th Ivy League returning to mandatory testing, Columbia remains the lone Ivy still test optional. Princeton cited 5 years of test optional data showing students with scores tended to perform better academically. So they're going beyond saying that people that did submit scores and had competitive scores tended to do better overall in terms of their 4 years at Princeton. For Brown, similarly, Brown's president announced reinstating test requirements for the class of 2029. Brown had paused tests in 2020, but decided the data showed SAT and ACT scores help with equitable access and academic matching. For Dartmouth, in February of 2024, Dartmouth's admissions office officially stated it will require tests for class of 2029 applicants. Dartmouth's announcement emphasized research showing test scores combined with GPA are strong predictors of college success and help identify talent across diverse backgrounds, which is something that we talked about just now. And then as for other Ivies, Yale and Cornell had already reinstated testing. Columbia and Penn remain test optional for now. Outside the Ivy League, many selective privates, for example, Caltech, also went back to requiring scores. So what does this mean for applicants? Even if a school is nominally test optional, a strong SAT/ACT score can still boost an application. So what we say at WinMay is we recommend students to go through admissions testing. And the idea is we tell students to include their scores if they have competitive scores. If not, to consider applying test optional. However, as you see, there is a growing trend for SAT scores and ACT scores going back to being required. So most students will probably have to go through that testing experience. For 2026 to 2027 admissions, applicants to top colleges should treat test prep as a priority. So that's what I was just saying. Weak scores can be omitted, but above average scores relative to a college's typical profile can only help. So that is what we base our advice on at WinMay. At the very least, plan to take the SAT/ACT again if your earlier scores were modest, since many peers will have enhanced their applications with tests. The era of ignoring standardized testing at lead schools is largely over, unfortunately. Academic rigor and curriculum. Top colleges are demanding strong academic preparation more than ever. Maxing out rigor with balance. Colleges judge GPA in context. This is really important. Two students with 4.0 GPAs might be very different. One took easy courses, one took the hardest possible schedule. Admissions committees increasingly look for applicants who took the most challenging classes their school offered. For instance, AP, IB, honors, dual enrollment, etc., and succeeded. An applicant with a mere 3.9 GPA but all honors classes may be viewed more favorably than a 4.0 in a lightweight curriculum. So the rigor is definitely something that's really, really important. Subject depth, particularly for STEM majors, courses like multivariable calculus, physics C, or upper division sciences signal readiness. For humanities, 2 years of foreign language and APs like English literature or history are expected. Taking just one AP or neglecting core subjects can stand out negatively in a pool where 90% of applicants will have many APs and IBs. I myself finished with 17 AP courses. Granted, 4 of those were half-credit courses. However, it's just an indication of the importance of taking APs and also making sure that you space out the APs, especially the hardest ones. You don't want to be taking all the hardest ones together. And lastly, grade inflation. awareness. Colleges know that grading standards vary by school. If everyone is near the top, admissions officers look for differences like A- versus A, or note students' improvement trajectory. They also value additional evidence of achievement, awards, competitions, research, when grades alone may not distinguish applicants. So previously, before they were discontinued, the College Board used to have SAT-2s subject tests. So you could take an SAT based on a specific subject, for instance, biology, physics, chemistry, etc. They did that because they needed more data to compare students by. But that's been, that's over and done with. But the principle still remains. When things get really competitive, you need more information, more data to be able to distinguish between two students. In the end, academics remains king in admissions. With so many qualified applicants, a polished academic record is the foundation. We always say that colleges will start by looking at your grades first at WinMay, because you're a student first. But colleges also know straight A's in all easy classes looks less impressive if peers are taking rigorous courses. So context is everything. The common tip from admissions deans is take the hardest schedule you can handle well. It shows willingness to challenge oneself. So looking back in my experience, I tried to maximize the number of APs that I took, mostly to challenge myself. I didn't necessarily do it for colleges. So I took everything from the STEM APs to taking, for instance, like AP French. Next, we will talk about holistic review and class composition. While grades and scores matter, admissions are still holistic. So what does this mean? Institutional priorities. Universities build a class to fulfill various goals: geographic and socioeconomic diversity, legacy balance, recruiting athletes, first-generation representation, etc. For example, in Harvard's announced class of 2026, 20.5% were Pell eligible, in other words, low income, and 20.3% were first-generation students. Colleges won't tell applicants how much each factor matters. This is always going to be undisclosed. This is the idea of quotas. But it does mean two equally qualified students might have different outcomes depending on these contexts. In other words, they're looking at the full context of a student's background. Demonstrated interest. Some schools track whether a student visited campus, attended a virtual info session, or corresponded with admissions. Private universities often use this as a tiebreaker, whereas Ivies officially say they don't track it. The insider note here is going to be that demonstrated interest, which is what this topic is called, can sometimes make a subtle difference at certain private colleges when deciding among equally strong candidates. It never hurts to show genuine enthusiasm, for example, by writing a thoughtful Why X University essay or attending an admitted student online event where you can ask questions and learn a little bit more about the school. Essays and recommendations. With so many stellar applications, colleges listen closely to voice and character in essays and recommendation letters. They look for authenticity, self-reflection, and what makes the student unique. This is the key concept here, uniqueness. Last year's admissions officers repeatedly said they love reading about growth and insight rather than I just volunteered at a soup kitchen and it was great. A secret to stand out. Tell a personal story that only you could tell, even if it's on a humble topic, and connect it to how you'll contribute to that university. Many advisors note that first drafts often read like college brochure statements. The final drafts that shine feel reflective and specific. extracurricular depth over breadth. Elite colleges prize depth and leadership. Having 10 clubs is less important than having a four-year leadership role or creative initiative in one or two activities. So when we have the leadership program. So it provides students with firsthand leadership experience because leadership is an important and rare skill. It's harder to be a leader than it is to be a follower. So organizing resources, organizing people is a very important skill, especially for today's changing world. Admissions officers can tell if an activity was just a resume filler. Admissions committees love seeing genuine passion and growth. One Stanford advisor told parents in an interview, true interest, like a multi-year science research project or starting a community program, signals motivation more than a dozen minor roles. So quality over quantity. Current events impact. Policies and trends, for instance, the Supreme Court decisions on race-conscious admissions, state bans on legacy consideration, etc., do influence tactics. For example, Harvard recently noted a slight uptick in admitted Asian American students, 27.8% for the class of 2026, amid ongoing legal scrutiny of admissions. Colleges are also pushing to admit more first-generation or Pell students through expanded outreach. Expect universities to continue to refine their diversity and inclusion strategies, sometimes publicly as in Harvard and Stanford statements, and sometimes quietly. Lastly, I wanted to focus on insider secrets and what's less known. Admissions isn't a strict formula. There is no magic points chart. Even well-informed counselors can't predict outcomes with certainty. An often heard insider quip, admissions is unpredictable. Even valedictorians get rejected from colleges they could have likely handled. This is partly because each applicant is one piece of a complex class puzzle. So you need to understand that context. Legacy and athletic preferences. So this is for my student athletes and legacy students. Although not publicly quantified, it's well known that legacy applicants and recruited athletes have much higher admit rates. After the Supreme Court eliminated race as a factor, many private universities still consider legacy and athletic status. Current trends suggest most Ivies are still admitting some legacies and athletes by tradition. For example, Dartmouth admits legacies at about double the general rate. But exact statistics and other information are rarely released. What's harder to find? New moves on this. One insider rumor, some colleges are quietly limiting legacies to avoid controversy, but details are scarce. In other words, despite the policies, it is still going on to a much lesser extent, however. Geographic targeting. Schools are setting rough goals for class diversity by region and school type. For instance, if a state already has many admits, applicants from other places may face steeper odds. Top colleges routinely say that admits from all 50 states and dozens of countries. While they won't reveal quotas, which we talked about before, some insight from common data set or press releases show admitted breakdowns. So here's the pro tip. If you're applying from a hotbed like the Northeast for many Ivies, make sure your application stands out in other ways, activities, essays, etc., because competition will be especially fierce. So there is a regional context now that you need to take into account when you apply. So I've heard of some students changing regions simply because it will be easier for them to stand out. The concept there is that they're going to a smaller pond, so it's easier for them to be chosen, to be selected. Application details. Each college has quirks. For example, Stanford's moved to ban legacy preferences due to California law, but most Ivy institutions in other states still consider it. some top schools also look at demonstrated interest. For instance, Michigan tracks visits, MIT and Stanford say they don't. These nuances are hard to research without inside context. Working well with experienced counselors or attending official admitted student events can give clues to such hidden factors. And lastly, for final insights, despite all these details, remember that top colleges value authenticity. The strongest applications in this competitive era are those who clearly demonstrate passion and fit. Those are two super important concepts. A polished, genuine voice in essays and interviews, many of those being optional, but they are recommended. Is the student going to engage with our campus community and make a difference? Can sometimes tip scales. Also keep perspective. Even perfect applicants get denied. The best strategy is to build a well-rounded profile, rigorous academics, meaningful activities, and clear interests. Apply smartly, early action, for instance, if you have a clear first choice. And keep a broad college list that includes targets and safeties. So with this, we conclude the presentation. But what I wanted to say is that you need to understand the full context of admissions trends in anticipation of application season to make sure that you position yourself well and increase your chances of getting accepted into these competitive colleges. Thank you.
感谢 Mr. Pierre 今天和我们的分享。你有任何的问题都可以直接来咨询文美集团。美国文美集团，美国大学申请规划服务第一品牌，20年经验，万博士领衔常春藤顾问团队，中美双顾问模式服务一个学生，按照大学录取学校排名收费，与孩子形成利益共同体。华人老品牌，值得您的信赖。文美集团隆重推出 ACAP 大学专业及职业测评规划管理系统，华人升学机构首创，完美解决华人学生最大升学痛点。人工智能提前锁定大学专业方向，提前2到5年布局申请。有了专业测评系统，孩子的课程规划更清晰，活动更聚焦，文书更有故事感，大学申请更有竞争力。5到11年级学生都可以报名参加测评。文美集团1对1非营利组织成立运营领导力项目，让孩子从参与者变为领导者，真正成长、成人、成才进名校。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。文美集团社会影响力联合国网络义工课程，节省孩子时间，做名校认可的社会影响力，高大上义工。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。感谢大家的收看，我们下次再见。